Hi and welcome to this tutorial. In the past few tutorials, we saw how to do wiring of beans inside Spring by using annotations. We used some auto wiring related annotations. We did auto wiring by name and by type, and we also used some JSR 250 annotations. All these annotations had a common requirement, which is that the bean that's actually getting injected into needs to be in the Spring XML. So here in the previous tutorial, we had a at resource which injected a point object into my circle class. So whenever a circle object was getting created by Spring, a point object was added as a dependency, and then it was injected into this member variable through the setter. But the thing is that the point object itself was defined as a bean in the Spring XML. So the circle as well was defined as a plain bean in the Spring XML. So in this tutorial, we're going to look at an annotation that declares a class as a bean. So we don't have to even add this XML tag in the Spring XML. Even this will go, and we can have all these configurations inside the class itself using annotations. So the way we do this is we need to tell Spring what classes of ours are going to be beans and what classes are not. In order to specifically tell Spring that a particular class needs to be a bean, what we need to do is we need to add an annotation called at component. Okay, so here I will import the component from org spring framework.stereotype. So this defines my circle class to be a Spring bean. I do not give a name, and the name is actually the name of the class, but of course in lowercase. So what Spring does is whenever it sees a class which has an at component, then what it does is this is actually equivalent to this. It's actually equivalent to defining this class as a bean and then creating a name for it, which is actually the name of the class itself. So this particular definition of the bean inside the XML can be achieved by using this at component annotation. So since we have added the add component, let's remove this. We don't need to define, we don't need to declare the circle bean inside the Spring XML. Now here, let's look at point. Now this point is actually defined with 3 different names, and it's defined in 3 different places. Now if I add an annotation to a class, and this is actually this problem is there for all annotations. Since the annotation is part of the class, you cannot have different instances of the beans for the same class. So what I mean by that is, if I add an annotation for the point class, now let me open up the point class. Here, now whatever annotation I add over here, it's going to lead to this point class behaving as one particular type of Spring bean only. Now in the Spring XML, I have defined 3 different beans from the same point class. It's obvious that since the annotations are going to be inside the class itself, it's not possible to have 3 different behaviors which result out of an annotation inside the class itself. We would either have to have three different classes, or we need to define the metadata inside the XML itself. So actually what we are looking at is one disadvantage of using annotations, or you can call it an advantage of using XML. You can use the same class and then define different beans with different metadata, and you can achieve that without having to write multiple classes. But then if you write annotations, you're going to restrict all the beans of that particular class to have a same behavior. But let's use this component annotation just for the circle, because we've seen that for the circle class we don't have multiple beans, we just have one instance of the bean. So we're going to use the add component annotation to define this circle class as a bean of name circle. So since we've also removed the bean definition inside the XML, we know for sure that it's the annotation that's going to get this circle class registered to Spring container as a bean. Now we have done a get bean of circle. So since this component marks this class as a bean of name circle, we should be good enough. But then there is one other thing we need to add in the Spring XML. Now Spring XML needs to know that you have beans inside your code that it needs to look for. So not only does it have to look for all the beans that you've defined here, it also has to look for all the beans inside your code. It has to look for annotations. So we need to ask Spring to scan through all our classes and then identify what annotations mark certain classes as beans. So in order to do this, what we do is we add context : component scan. So this is the tag that tells Spring that it needs to scan for components. The components being the beans marked as add component. So there is a property that I need to enter here. This is the base package. So what I need to tell Spring is the base package in which Spring needs to scan for all the classes for the add component tag. Now, why does it not scan everything? Because it's more efficient to restrict the search to a particular set of classes, and it also has some other advantages. We'll have a look at that down the line. But then what we need to do now is we need to tell Spring what is the base package in which it needs to scan all the classes for the tags that mark certain classes as beans. So I'll use this the only package that I have over here. Okay, I've given the package name, and then just closes the tag. Let me just close it here itself. Okay, so again, all I've done is I've told Spring that it needs to scan the code for annotations that depict certain classes as beans, and then in one of those classes I have marked an add component which marks this particular class as a Spring bean. So I will save this. And now we are all set. So now, because of this particular tag, it's going to scan all these classes for any annotations that mark any of these classes as beans. It finds one in the circle, sees this as a component, so it's going to register this class as a bean, and then it's going to give it a name called circle, and of course it's going to take the first letter as lowercase. So now what's going to happen is, in my main method, I have a get bean of circle, and it's going to initialize this bean. It's going to get this bean, and then of course I have a resource inside this bean which is going to work as earlier. So this resource is going to look for a bean called center, because this is the name here, and it finds a bean with the name center. So it's going to initialize, it's going to do this assignment, and it's going to give the bean that we want. So if we run this class now, so here you can see it's going to get a circle bean. The init and destroy are all remnants of our previous coding which we did in an earlier tutorial, so don't worry about that. So the point here to note is that a circle bean has been initialized, and then a point has been assigned to the bean, and then we are getting that bean using a get bean. And all this is happening thanks to this annotation, which marks this class as a component, and then this particular tag which tells Spring to scan for those components. Now this component scan tag searches for a few other annotations apart from the @component annotation. So these annotations are actually called as stereotypes. So the concept of stereotypes is something like this. When you write enterprise applications in Spring, you would have some standard Spring beans that perform some standard roles. You would have a data object, you would have a service class, you would have a view, you would have a controller. So all these are stereotypical roles that some Spring beans perform in any enterprise application. So what Spring has done is it has some annotations that let us define a particular bean as one of those, define a particular bean to do one of those roles. Now let's say, for example, that this actually happened to be a service layer class. This was actually a service implementation. Then what we could actually do is, instead of @component, we could have a @service. Okay, now this @service is again from our Spring Framework .stereotype. Now if I mark this, this is going to work as well. Even this is going to get picked up by this component scan tag, and if we run this, it's still going to work. It's going to register this as a bean, and it's going to give it a name of circle, so nothing changes. It's as if you have added a @component here, but then @service is going to give Spring additional information that there's actually a service bean. Now if this were a data object, I could call this @repository, and then this again is a Spring Framework stereotype. So this is a stereotype that tells Spring that this is actually a data object. And now we have one more, which is the @controller. Now this tells that it's actually it's a controller, again from stereotype. The controller is again the C of the MVC. So if you have an MVC pattern implemented for your view, then you can mark the controller objects as @controller, and Spring knows that this is actually a controller. The functioning of these tags, at least initially, is no different from an @component, but then an @component is something generic. You're just going to tell Spring that, hey, it's a bean. But if you mark it as a at service or at repository or at controller, then you're going to tell Spring that you're going to let Spring know that something else. You're going to let Spring know what role the bean is doing. There are many reasons why you'd want to do that. First of all, it actually adds a level of documentation. You look at the bean and you know what role the bean does. And then there are a few other advantages as well. We'll look at that when we come to aspect-oriented programming. But for now, think of this as some extra information that you're giving to Spring about what role the bean does in the whole enterprise application. And then it also acts as a little bit of documentation that marks the role of the bean for a human reader of the class as well.